So, Christopher, is there a danger when we're dealing with anything with a scientific angle to it that we imply a false degree of certainty to it and we're not willing to take in other options?
I think that depends on what field of science it is. I think probably in most fields of science, no. I think there's a very open mind, and the essence of science is to try and falsify things. But I don't think that's always true, and I think the more politically sensitive a particular field is, the greater pressure there is for conformity. And the reason for that, and the reason I talked today about the public health movement with this, going all the way back to Jon Snow and the flack he got for suggesting that cholera might be waterborne rather than spread by bad smells, was back then the medical profession were very keen on getting rid of these polluting industries, probably with good reason. London almost certainly would have stank of all kinds of smells. So you can understand that, but they were justifying it on the basis of miasma theory. And when Snow came along and said, don't think it is this, things might smell so much they might make you sick, but that doesn't mean you're going to die from them. Why don't you look at the pollution of the water? They didn't want to hear it. And his theory was ignored until after he was dead, and the Lancet laid into him. And it's only actually, I think, last year that the Lancet finally apologised for his extremely terse obituary. And they even then apologised in a slightly flippant way about it. But I mean, the point is that nothing's really changed, and public health have got certain policies in mind, which are pretty easy to predict. Essentially, it's the anti-tobacco blueprint being rolled out. So if you look at what they're doing with junk food and sugar and fat, well, sugar mainly these days, it's the same thing.
They're looking for the next tobacco.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sugar is the new tobacco. This is what people literally say. And they're going to deal with it as they're going to deal with alcohol, which is essentially as they dealt with cigarettes. So, restrict the advertising, then ban the advertising, put warnings on them, then put graphic warnings on them, then possibly put them in plain packaging. And if you get enough momentum, then you ban them altogether.
But it seems that tobacco, in a way, is quite rare in that we have established a clear link between tobacco, heart disease, and cancer. Whereas, say, with cholesterol or sugar, though that silver bullet, if you like, that smoking gun, if I can mix metaphors, has never been found.
Right, but I don't think it ever will be, because I think everything in moderation is pretty sensible advice when it comes to diet. But I think it's the desire to find literally the new tobacco, the new smoking, that has led some people to isolate a particular ingredient. And it was saturated fat for a very long time. And there was a huge consensus on that. And if you tried to argue against it, you faced all kinds of problems. And that, it feels almost like overnight that has changed to sugar. And there's gaping holes in the evidence that sugar is somehow uniquely evil, the calorie is not a calorie, and so on. And I don't think we've got to a sort of McCarthyite stage, yet with that. But as you saw with this Australian paradox study, where it was claimed in this study that sugar consumption has been going down while obesity is going up, the response to that was not, it wasn't sort of, it's a falsifiable hypothesis, let's see if we can falsify it. It was, what are these people saying? They must be in the pay of big sugar, and we're going to take them to their university and do them for scientific misconduct.
And yet there's another paradox in that our rate of heart disease is declining. It's about half of what it was in the 1970s, and yet, of course, our obesity has gone up. We are, in fact, we have the fourth longest life expectancy in the world. So how does that tally with the idea we're somehow one of the most obese nations?
It is, it is one of the great mysteries, really, the scale of the decline of heart disease. I mean, you can attribute some of it to the decline in smoking, and you can probably attribute some of it to better medical care and probably maybe statins. Again, controversial. Consensus is moving on that too, to some extent. But yeah, I mean, it's great news, the decline in heart disease. You don't hear a lot about it because you don't hear a lot about great news, generally. I think it's probably not true to say that the rise of obesity and the decline in heart disease is a inexplicable paradox, because there's so many factors involved with heart disease. But yeah, I mean, the scale of it, it's been like an epidemic. You know, it has all the features of an epidemic, the huge rise and then the huge decline, and nothing really tallies with it.
It seemed to me when you were discussing this morning the cholera epidemic and the attempts to find a solution to that, you could see how the moral crusade was blurring the health crusade, that it was almost became an issue of improving people's manners and behaviour rather than necessarily improving their health. Is that true?
Yeah, I think to the extent that it was all about cleaning up the air, and it didn't really matter if it was going to prevent cholera. It was just a good thing in itself. That happens a lot. You know, it's like with the smoking bans. It's going, well, it doesn't matter if the evidence for this is not particularly great. Isn't it going to be nice to have nice clean pubs and your clothes won't smell of smoke? And you even get it with climate change. People will say, well, you know, even if this is exaggerated and we're not facing the apocalypse, it's still a great thing. We won't be reliant on coal and we'll have all this clean energy. So what's not to like about it, you know? So if it's all benefits, then you don't need to worry about any potential costs.
You see this sort of bandwagon effect, don't you? You know, X is banned in X country, so why haven't we?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And it's Australia with plain packaging recently, but also the fat tax in Denmark. It's like the opposite of what you would expect. Normally you think if there's only one country that's done something out of 200, it's like, well, probably we'll side with the 199. But it doesn't work like that in public health. It's like this country is leading the way and we're all being left behind.
Could you foresee what the next campaign is once we've moved on from the current ones?
Well, it's going to take a while to move on from alcohol and sugar. I would think gambling is quite a likely one. I've seen that starting to move into the public health arena. It's really not a public health issue at all. But I noticed a recent conference in New Zealand, it was tagged on to the usual suspects of alcohol and tobacco and fatty food. So yeah, I mean that's what you expect from sort of studying the history of the prohibition movement. I mean after prohibition, the slogan was literally nicotine next. And the cranks came out of the woodwork, and people like J.H. Kellogg, who, you know, a great Puritan really, he was against tea drinking, and there were a lot of people who went off after coffee next, and it was just going to be one thing after another, and the dominoes were falling. Except of course it didn't happen because they had enough problems trying to cope with prohibition. And it all finally got rolled back. But now I think we are sort of 100 years later, I think we're going through the same cycle where it's like, okay, this time it's smoking first, but then it's going to be alcohol next and sugar. But I mean, going back to the topic of groupthink and why it comes around in certain areas, I just think that you've got a very fine line between academics and activists in some of these areas. And a lot of these people were activists before they became academics, you know. And so they are first and foremost interested in getting some laws changed and having reforms. And the evidence very often just follows from that conclusion. You know, they start with the conclusion and build the evidence around it. So if you've got a very activist-focused area of academia, then yeah, it's going to attract other activists. It's going to repel people who aren't that bothered about political campaigning. They'll go off and do something else. And so you have quite a homogenous field. And if anybody steps out of line or comes up with some evidence, either deliberately or accidentally comes up with some evidence that suggests that either that the problem that they're addressing is not as serious as they thought, or suggests that the policies being put forward are not going to work as well as were thought or might create some unintended consequences. That is not what they want to hear. Because the politicians really want to hear, they don't just want the consensus, they want a unanimous consensus. They want to believe that the science is completely rock solid so they can have a justification for acting. And if there's a bit of doubt comes up, then they'll just think, oh, maybe it's a bit early to act now. So it's the last thing the campaigners want.
What do you think of these arguments we frequently hear? 95% of climate scientists think X, or 80% of economists say Y. Is that a way, can you judge science that way?
Well, you shouldn't, should you? I mean, if a huge number of experts agree on something, there's a good prima facie case for thinking that is probably the correct decision. It's almost like the rational markets argument.
But it
it's
doesn't
like
prove it.
No, it doesn't. But it doesn't prove it at all. No, it just tells you what the state of thinking is at any one time. And of course, science is generally self-correcting, but that consensus can change very quickly, as it has with fat and sugar, very quickly indeed. And it's not always quite clear why. Sometimes the consensus takes a while to catch up with the evidence, or sometimes it just seems to be almost a force of nature. It changes with the wind.
So the place for the contrarian or the contrary voice in the debate. You defend that.
Absolutely defend it, and I don't think it's under any real threat in terms of the media. I think the media quite like a quote contrarian. I don't like the word contrarian really. It suggests that there's something staged about it, which occasionally there is. There are some journalists who I think deliberately kind of exaggerate their position and are more inflammatory than they probably need to be. But yeah, I think in general, in the media, in public life, there's no danger of, to free speech of just being contrarian as such. Being offensive or something might be a different kettle of fish. But in some areas in university is very worrying. There's no platform movement, and the way free speech is it's probably under more threat in universities than it is anywhere else. That's the ironic thing. And there's there are hundreds of examples of this documented, particularly on American campuses, but also in Britain. For example, recently the Nietzsche Society was banned at, I think it was UCL, on the basis that Nietzsche was a fascist and that we shouldn't be promoting fascism. And well, it's debatable that Nietzsche was a fascist. He said so many self-contradictory things, it's rather difficult to pigeonhole him. But the thing about Nietzsche is he's on the syllabus at university. It's the only people who read Nietzsche are students, So the idea of having it on the syllabus and then banning the society.
This is indicative of a new way of arguing, isn't it? Well, maybe it's not new, but it's commonly used now, that we don't attack the argument. We don't attack Nietzsche's philosophy. We argue with Nietzsche, not his philosophy.
And we just call everyone we don't like fascists.
That's right. Or phobics.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
On which note, thanks for joining us at Consilium, Chris.
Yes, great to be here.